Matt, why don't you run the numbers for the Residents? And I believe Josh starts us off in that segment.
So the Residents-ESKIMO comes in at number 922 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, number 90 in 1979, number 5,334 of all time. It's the Residents' sixth highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. So, John, why this one though?
This is the most critically well-regarded album.
Not on Best Ever Albums, it's not. That's interesting.
Well, if you do some, we've talked about some of the bios this week. Should I just go into this bio right here
a little bit? For it.
So I was fascinated by this album. I won't go into my take yet.
Where did you hear about this album?
Yeah.
It just comes up often in different, people will mention that they're intrigued by this album. And from time to time in music magazines and stuff, I've read this album comes up, and the name, the Residents, right? I couldn't quite get it. They feel like they could be like a punk band, or a garage band, or I didn't quite have any idea what they were. Like I said, I'm going to really try to stay away from the take, because I want you guys to be able to do it. But I do want to give a little bit of a background on the Residents. And I will fully admit that this week I did a lot of research in a couple different sources, but for ease of condensing the bio, since we don't do full bios in this, it's just basically usually a full take. I'm going to use all music, so I'll try to credit the author who writes this. So in this case, this is the artist bio of the Residents by Mark Deming. So thank you for doing this. It does say, over the course of a recording career spanning several decades, the Residents have remained a riddle of sphinx-like proportions. Cloaking their lives in music in a haze of willful obscurity, the band's members never identified themselves by names, though in the 2010s they would begin playing with the notion of individual identities, which kind of sounded like the Gorillaz to me a little bit, you know what I mean? Yeah. That there's cartoon figures, but I thought the album cover, one of them is hilarious. It's like the Meet the Beatles cover, but with their eyes but with their eyes
there had to
sort
be
of
a lawsuit there, didn't it? It was.
I don't know. On. But they're often shown with that weird long nose penguin-y type mask and a top hat and a giant eyeball. You know the type of. I'm trying to think where else I've seen it, but it's a very an anarchist type. Not like the V for Vendetta anarchist, but another sort of Clockwork Orange,
Mr. Robot.
Yeah, Clockwork Orangey, Mr. Robot type feel. Yeah, exactly. Well, the Mr. Robot's more like a cart,
on the album cover here, they're all in tuxedos with eyeball heads and top hats on top of the eyeballs.
So. Yeah, exactly. So, kind of going in and summarizing a little bit, some of the stuff I found very interesting was that they just they said that they had a guy who was behind them. That they identified, and it's largely suspected that it's Captain Beefheart, which I know, shocking, right?
Yeah.
Is who it is. The person's name was N. Sonata was the name of the which I thought was funny along the way, and their names were names like Philip Lithman. Now remember, these names came later, right? Randy Rose, Bob, Chuck, and Philip Lithman was the name of it, but. Needless to say, these guys were experimental in nature, and sort of a big part of their feel was they kind of had that craft work and, like I mentioned, the Gorillaz type thing, Daft Punk a little bit, where they're sort of entities. But unlike those other groups that I think had some degree of who each person was, this was sort of we're not quite sure who these people are.
Taken to the extreme.
Right? Yeah, and they do know that they met in Shreveport, Louisiana during the early 60s and ended up in California, in San Francisco in particular, which, sure, that seems like it fits too. So, yeah, that's a little bit of the context of this band. They're sort of a nameless, faceless entity that was about pushing the boundaries of music. Okay, there's a little bit. They're representatives of the Cryptic Corporation specifically, and much like Kraftwerk, they would not grant media interviews. So I don't know if they had a phone, that you had to call at a certain time. Who was that group? Was that the Monks?
No, that was Kraftwerk.
Was it Kraftwerk? Yeah, the phone you had to call at the exact time. Yeah, so.
And hope that they would pick up.
And hope
because it didn't ring, right? It didn't ring, so they would just occasionally pick it up.
They would occasionally pick it up at a time, and you had to get it, which still is remarkable to me. But all right, well, that's a little bit of a bio there. We'll revisit it. Josh, what were your thoughts on Eskimo by the Residents?
Well, incredibly, this wasn't the most difficult album to listen to this week, in my opinion.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It is, well, I mean, the bio kind of sums up the viewpoint going into the listening experience, or once you hear the album, you realize that they are really trying to push a viewpoint, push a aesthetic, push I don't know, a feeling more than anything. And that's kind of the feeling I got listening to this album. Is is it even?
Did you
music?
pick up that? Did you pick up that this was theoretically a concept album, Josh? Because it is.
Based on the titles of the tracks, I would say yes. But
did you catch what the theme was of this album?
No.
I'll once again
Life
quote
in the
from
Arctic.
Ostensibly, this is a quote. Ostensibly, a musical documentary on the Eskimo.
Oh, right,
But
okay,
actually,
that
they
makes
think
sense.
it was sort of a put on a little bit as well, because the lyrics. I think it is designed to, in some ways, talk about how the Eskimo is treated. You know, how they were treated, but also there's a weird idea of like Western commercial themes in an album about indigenous populations.
Okay.
There you go.
Interesting.
I'm sure you picked that up immediately, Josh. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that makes sense in the terms of the titles, because you've got the Walrus Hunt, Arctic Hysteria, things like that in the titles. So, and I do kind of, to be fair, I did pick up on what felt like some world music vibes, or like Native American chanting, maybe like Eastern Asian type of sound music, and this really, I don't know, it's hard to classify this as music. It's more of like a soundscape, I would describe it as. They're really trying to put you in, I guess, what would be like if you were in the Arctic. There's a constant wind blowing throughout this tracks, and there's a real haunting feeling to this, a feeling of isolation, and a lot of chanting and layering of sounds, and water effects also I picked up on. So with all of that, I couldn't pick up on the vocals and what they were saying. The chanting kind of at sometimes is like onomatopoeia, or like made up language in the way that it is in, like, I don't know, the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks or something. But then it does become like regular vocals that you can hear what they're saying. And it also kind of evokes, they sound like Minions at times. If anyone's familiar with the Despicable Me franchise, they sound like that group of beings. And then it transitions into normal chanting. It also kind of evokes aliens or UFOs at times, I felt like. And I don't know what else. There is some music, I guess, underneath all of that, but it's really sparse, and surprisingly, it wasn't difficult to listen to, but it almost felt like an album you would play at Halloween when your trick-or-treaters are coming up to the door or something, and that's kind of the vibe it is.
Yeah.
And it's not really, unlike another album that we talk about later, it's not really jarring, I would say, and it's not really hard. I didn't find it hard to listen to, but it wasn't necessarily enjoyable. I'm not doing a good job at describing what the actual music sounds like, but I
actually think you're doing a very good job, Josh.
It's unlike anything we've listened to before in some ways, because it's really deviating from all Western sort of traditional music, even anything that the krautrock brought to it. It's really going for something else entirely, and it's unique in that aspect.
Okay, Matt. Why don't you jump in?
I'll just go right in and say this is not music. You know, it's. I was hoping it would be, because I saw initially, I was like, okay, this seems like it's a interesting album cover, and there's only 6 songs and it's 40 minutes, so there's several. Most of the tracks are longer, and kind of starts off with like the like, as Josh you described, you got the wind and kind of some of these effects. I was like, okay, maybe there's going to be something kind of cool. Like, I don't know if you're going to get like a synth or like a like maybe a Pink Floyd kind of soundscape, if you will. And it wasn't like that at all. It just kind of stayed. Josh, I thought you did a good job of describing it, because it's very much in that line. You kind of do feel like you're, just hearing sounds that you're like in an igloo or something, right? Mm-hmm. And this is what you hear outside, right? Like with the Eskimo people. I actually thought that some part of it sounded like the Sand People from Star Wars. Like there's some parts where they're like chanting like that. And I did notice, because I noticed that on the Spotify app now that they have lyrics. I'm like, well, there's lyrics there. So if you clicked on that, and I don't know if either of you did that, but they're not.
I've been doing that recently quite a bit. Yeah.
But they're not lyrics that go along, because there's no lyrics to the song, and it really is just chanting. I don't think there's really many decipherable words.
Right. They
at least
the
in
lyrics.
English.
The lyrics are designed to be, according to everything I've read, sort of like satire, kind of.
Well, it's a story, right? It's a story like the birth tells of the story of like the birth of like, and somewhat graphic detail, like what happens when an Eskimo woman gives birth. And it's kind of like this narrative story and I didn't read all of it. I was like, okay, I'm not going to get all into that. Maybe I should have, I don't know. But, I think, Josh, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's not music. It wasn't hard to listen to, but I didn't really find it particularly interesting as far as listening to it for music's purposes. It is more of a kind of I would say it's something that you would put on in the background. But I don't know why I would do that. There's other music I'd rather put on the background that's got like a beat or a melody or something behind it.
There's no beat.
Yeah, there's drumming happening, right? But it's not. It's kind of just it's existing on its own, like just doing. And it doesn't really seem to be much rhyme or reason. So I did see. I think these guys have like. John, did I see somewhere they have like 60 albums or something?
Over 60 albums.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I can't imagine like what else they got, because it can't be all this. But I don't know. This, maybe this was something that was influential, or maybe it did something that was, kind of inspired other musicians to incorporate different types of sounds into their music or to certain vibes, and for that it's well and good. But yeah, I wasn't really grabbed by this really at all. And I'm here for music. This, again, I don't really classify this as music. So yeah, I'm thumbs down on this. It's for another purpose. And I like your description. This is something to put in your house while trick-or-treaters go by, because that's really what it is. It's those types of sounds.
It's really kind of the definition of avant-garde or abstract. It's not music in a traditional sense.
It's like experimentation too, and they're going with a theme of sorts, and they're trying to get you in a vibe, which okay, but I would even hesitate to say that this is like a movie soundtrack, that this is like, you know what I mean? Because it's still not really music that I would call music anyway. So, John?
Yeah, I like to try to draw comparisons to stuff we've listened to, and there really isn't one.
No.
The Trout Mask Replica, I guess, is the only thing that was as a concept similar to this, where it's primarily sounds as opposed to what I would call popular music. There's a lot of artists we've covered who try to deconstruct traditional Western music or melody or just kind of the things that define what we would call Western music. But I don't know if there's anything that has... The only thing I can compare this to that I'm aware of is something like those ambient sound albums that Brian Eno did, like from the airport. And we haven't covered those, but he did the airport sounds, and where it's as much about like listening to something as sounds and ascertaining the concept of music from it. And I think a lot of my understanding of folks that go down that path, it's the dissonance between sounds, the idea of space with jarring sounds in or spread out sounds, something that just makes you even more aware of the silence and almost makes the silence a sound itself. And I definitely noticed bits and pieces of that. There's also repetition a lot of times in albums like that. I mean, we certainly see that in the krautrock stuff. I think the repetition in this wasn't so much a type of sound or even you read a lot about that they use drum beat for that, but I didn't catch a lot of drum beat. It really was that wind concept that was the unifying sound of this album. So that's kind of like an overview of how I heard this album. I'm with you guys. This is certainly, boy, as a cold listen hot take, it's hard. But it's also, I don't even know where I would enter this as music, because this felt more like when you were in like a physical science class and you did one of those lab projects where there's a whole bunch. I remember I'd do something called the sludge lab, right? And the sludge lab was all of these things were like put together, and you had to like use things like burning and distilling and putting in water to kind of see what the individual elements are. And I felt like this was sort of, for me, like a sonic sludge lab, where I was just going through and trying to use parts of what I've learned both historically and through this journey through albums to help me deconstruct what this is. And I still struggled because of the fact that I feel like I would just need to listen to it as almost like an academic exercise, if that makes sense. And I struggle with what the context would be, where, unless I was a professional musician or someone who was in recording, like where I would indulge in that. Does that make sense?
The only this is like a perfect example of something that would be at an art museum as like an exhibit, quote unquote, where you sit in like a room on a bench or something while this plays, and you're supposed to try, there's a little plaque explaining it, or there's like a something projected while you're listening to it. That seems to be the only context that you would come across this and try and appreciate it in that context.
Yeah. So it's very hard for me to give this a rating, because I don't know how I can rate this on a traditional music scale. Like the music scale I used to give a score on mine is things like, lyrics, melody, replayability, and it's like, how do I
zero.
Well, but I don't want to give it a 0, because it's clearly not
right.
designed to do that. It's designed to give me sounds to contemplate, and B, to, as Josh mentioned very accurately, evoke a mood or a feeling. Yeah. I just struggle with I shouldn't say I struggle, because in other contexts I can do it, but I think if we're being honest about the idea that we're a music review show, I like to think that we're very open-minded, but I think this might be a little further outside of what I recognize as music for me to evaluate on a music podcast.
So you weren't expecting this, even though you knew the Residents, you weren't expecting this, were you?
No. I like I said, I legitimately have seen it, but had no idea of what the sound was. So when I got this, I said, whoa, this is like in that realm of Trout Mask Replica or the more complicated things by Can or Faust, right? But even those were sounds, and even
elements
sounds at times done well, and also like elements of sonic structures that I could recognize, that even if I didn't think they were music, I could recognize them as like a sonic thing that did some of the things that bass lines or percussion did in traditional music, right? Mm-hmm. This seemed even divorced from that.
I mean, those are, compared to this, those are like entirely commercial albums.
Well, I thought it was hilarious that their next album is called Commercial Album, which made me laugh. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're probably the only people that listen to this album on Spotify this week around the world. I mean,
there are not many listens on this record.
Well, and I feel like sound engineers is who I feel like listen to this. Yeah. My buddy Jeff. Shout out to you, Jeff, if you're listening. He's about the only other person.
Jeff probably loves these guys. He's probably like been to all their shows and like,
And they're the whole thing with the dressing up and hiding the identities and the eyeball masks and stuff, and all the covers of their albums are very like interesting and spooky and clearly they're trying to be weird.
I feel like I would love someone who legit like isn't, because I think this is a band that wouldn't even inspire people who are kind of up their own ass. You know what I mean? Trying to pretend they understand. I feel like the people that listen to this album, like, truly do get it. You know, like, get it. And I'd love to have one of those people, like, reach out or comment on this. And I'm not being, like, snickery. Like, I would love to have it described to me, because I feel like someone hearing and getting that added layer, I'd be fascinated to hear where it was and even try to come at the album with a greater context of it. I just don't know if I am a good enough sonic auteur to be able to do that. I would need like a Sherpa into this world.
Yeah, this is it's just different, right? Like I said, this is not falling into, even with an album like Trout Mask Replica or any of the krautrock or anything else that we've done, there's, you know, I never questioned whether it was music or not. You know, it was always like, okay, it's definitely, this is its own
I questioned
category.
Trout Mask Replica a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I did a little bit.
Well, I mean, there's guitar. I mean, I don't know. Anyway, but the most listens on this record, the first track, The Walrus Hunt, 90,762. And it goes down from there. You know, I think the least amount's like they're in the 10,000 range. So, yeah, there's not a ton of listens that people are giving this. But hey, I know of them now. I can speak somewhat intelligently, or just some knowledge base on them. So
that's the cool thing about this show. I like trying stuff that I never would have listened to, because now we're going to have such a tapestry of things that, you know, watch there be something in the 80s where we're like, oh, that's an element of Eskimo by the Residents. And now I recognize that it's there. Yeah, which I kind of like the idea of being able to do that. But yeah, this is one, I think I'll end with this. I would love to hear from someone who loves this album, because I would love to eventually try this again, but with Cliff Notes maybe. To see where it would come from. So if you are someone who this album speaks to, please reach out, and maybe we'll do it as an exercise.